All right, we're going to get going in a minute. If you can hear my voice out there in the lobby and want to straggle in, mosey on in. I never moseyed before. Sashayed once. Anyone know what movie that is? City Slickers? Moseyed on over here. I never moseyed before. I sashayed once. All right, well, thanks for being here. I know some of you have been with us the last few summers, so this will be a little change of pace because I've been doing Old Testament books. And like I said last week with Dr. Tony, when he decided to do Psalms, I thought, okay, well, I'll choose a New Testament book this summer to do, and so this will be fun. I love the Gospel of Luke. I think each of the Gospel writers really has something different that they bring to the table. And as I kind of laid out, if you read the, class description I had, we put online or something, what this next 5 weeks, these 5 Thursdays in August is going to look at is, why did Luke write what he wrote? What makes his gospel different than the other gospel writers? Why did he include certain stories that they did not? Why did he leave out stories that they included? And so we're just going to look at what does Luke want us to focus on? Why did he decide he needed to throw his hat in the ring and write a gospel as well? And so... as we say here, let's see. So I think we do this every summer. Prolegomena is just a fancy way of saying the introduction, the things before the things. There's a couple things we got to talk about and introduce and kind of get out of the way before we can dive in. Here's a painter's rendition of the 4 evangelists, as he calls them, so the 4 gospel writers, kind of all huddled together there. We're not going to spend a ton of time really trying to delve into the dating of the gospels. We're going to talk about it briefly in a minute when we talk about where did the gospel writers get their source material, I guess, like where did they get their, especially for Luke, where did he get his sources for his gospel? But in general, the general thinking currently, for the last few hundred years, at least too, is that Mark's gospel was written first. So the Gospel of Mark, probably the earliest dating I've ever really seen for the Gospel of Mark is something like 56 AD. So generally we date Jesus' life from about being born in 6 or 4 BC and dying probably about 30 AD. So even Mark's gospel, if his gospel is even written in 56 AD, you can see that that's 25, or so years later. So generally we think of Mark's gospel as being the very first one written. Matthew and Luke come next, depending on how you kind of put them in a certain order. They are probably, Mark is probably written closer to 70, maybe after 70. The reason that it's important, the only dating instance that's really important is that 70 AD number, because 70 AD is when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and everything else. So there's always questions of, is this gospel writer writing from a position of knowing the temple has been destroyed, or are they writing from a position of not knowing that yet because that has not happened? So let's say Mark's somewhere around 70. Matthew and Luke are probably in the 80s being written. John is usually dated much later than those three, usually in the 90s or even up to like 110 AD or something like that. One thing to know about the 4 Gospels, we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke synoptic Gospels, which just is a fancy way of saying same, similar, synoptic. because Matthew, Mark, and Luke really are similar gospels. They share a lot of stories. In fact, here's just an example. We're going to look at a couple of these because depending on how visual you are on certain things, one of these slides might make more sense to you than the others, but we call these like the two-source hypothesis, a four-source hypothesis. Basically what it means is since Mark's gospel is written first, that Matthew and Luke use Mark's gospel. They know of Mark's gospel. They know it's in circulation. They've read it. They use it as part of their source material. And for Luke, he uses Mark's gospel as a kind of a framework for his own. He's going to depart from it a lot and not follow all the same things Mark does, but he really uses Mark's gospel as a basis for his own. Matthew does in a lot of similar ways as well. So both Matthew and Luke are going to use Mark's gospel. Now there's stuff that's in Matthew and Luke that is not in Mark. So scholars have come up with this idea of a source called Q. You can see it up there on the left-hand side. In parentheses it says quell. That's just a word that means literally source, because we don't know what it is. But we know that Matthew and Luke have stories that they share, but they didn't get it from Mark. So the thinking is they got it from some other book, and we don't have that book. Sometimes people think it's a gospel. Last week, if you were here, Dr. Tony mentioned other gospels other than the 4 that are in our Bible. We're not going to get real into the weeds on any of those, although I'll start next week sharing just some really funny stories from some of those gospels that aren't in our Bible about Jesus' life as a boy, because we really only get one story of Jesus' life as a boy from any of our 4 gospel writers between birth and the start of his ministry around 30 years old. So for 30 years, we basically get nothing except one story in Luke. And so these other gospel writers have some pretty amusing stories about Jesus' life as a boy. So we'll start next week by kind of laughing at some of those, talking about those. But for these, for our 4 gospels, again, we don't. There's a gospel called the Sayings Gospel of Thomas, and some people think that Luke and Matthew used that. But we don't really know what this Q source is. We really might one day find it. Just a few years ago, they discovered a gospel called the Gospel of Mary. And so we might one day find that source we just call Q right now. But so both Matthew and Luke have stuff in their gospels that they got from Mark. Matthew and Luke also have stuff in their gospels they got from seemingly some other source. So then there's also stuff that Matthew has that only he has. And Luke has stories that only he has. So then we also see there, like you can see to the right of Luke, there's just an L, and to the left of Matthew, there's just an M. Here's another way of saying, maybe this is better, easier for you to visualize. So again, Mark over there on the far left contributes to both Matthew and Luke. You can see Q there on the right in the middle contributes to both Matthew and Luke. And then Matthew has his own sources, and Luke has his own sources, because there's stuff in their gospels that only they have. You're not going to be able to see all these percentages, but just as a reminder, I'll send this whole slideshow out to you each week. So if you haven't yet just signed up on our website or through the app to say you're coming to this class, do that if you want the slides. If you don't want the slides, you don't have to do it. But we'd still like to know, but you don't have to But if you do that, then when I send the email out, you'll get these slides. So I realize sometimes you won't be able to see these up on the big screen. But this version here, just to tell you what you're seeing, it gives you actual percentages, like what percentage of Luke's gospel came from Mark? What percentage of Luke's gospel is only his material versus stuff he shares with Matthew from that, Q source. So all that to say, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's out in left field on his own. He does stuff totally differently. His gospel is really very, very different. There's a few stories that John tells us that we see in the synoptic gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, like the feeding of the crowds, like feeding of the 4,000, feeding the 5,000. And then, of course, I mean, the death and resurrection is there. He tells it differently than the others. But even Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the death and resurrection of Jesus differently as well. So John's kind of out there on his own. But one thing we know is it wasn't like this. They didn't get together in a group and copy off each other's papers and sit there and say, well, what are you doing? Oh, I like that. I'm putting that in mine. So we know it didn't happen like this. Any questions or comments on that? Okay. I'm going to use the NIV 2011 version. That's the version. If I put, sometimes I'll put the Bible passages up on the screen. Other times I'll just be reading them and you can follow along. If you like other versions, I encourage you can use those, because sometimes I'll ask who's got a different version, because sometimes the wording in a different version is better than the NIV 2011, or it's just there's a comparison we'll make or something like that. So if you've got a certain version you like, you don't need to change whether you're bringing a physical Bible or reading on an app or something like that. But you can switch to this, because that's the version I'll read out of. One thing I'll mention is people get, you'll usually see the gospel according to Luke. You don't really see it ever say Luke's gospel. And the reason that is because if you look in your Bible, it normally say the gospel of Luke or the gospel according to Luke. Because the distinction people made in church history is Luke doesn't have total ownership over the gospel message. So it's not Luke's gospel. It's the gospel according to Luke. Now, I'm not going to make that distinction. I'm going to keep saying Luke's gospel or the gospel of Luke or something like that. So you don't need to feel like if you say Luke's gospel, I'm going to be like, the church fathers are going to get you. So we're going to ask ourselves, who was Luke and why did he write? That's kind of what we're going to start off tonight with. Well, who was this guy? Who was Luke and why did he write this gospel? But first, just some kind of introductory facts about Luke here. It's the longest gospel. It's actually the longest New Testament book. We just went through on Sunday mornings the book of Acts. And as you might remember from that sermon series, Luke wrote the book of Acts as well. So we often call this book, he wrote Luke Acts, because it's supposed to be in two parts. In fact, you'll see, in a minute here, we'll get to Luke's introduction to his gospel, and he's writing to a man named Theophilus. And then he starts the book of Acts by saying, in my former book, Theophilus, in other words, in my gospel I wrote, in the former book. So Luke means Luke and Acts to be one kind of combined book. So you'll often see that called just Luke Acts, because it's supposed to be understood as one book. Paul wrote more letters, like of the books of the Bible, but if you take just the sheer number, like volume of words written in the New Testament, Luke wrote the most in the New Testament. It's the only gospel written by a Gentile. So generally we think of Mark as really getting his source a lot from Peter. Matthew, of course, and John are both apostles themselves. But so Luke is the only one who is a Gentile. He was not a Jewish person. So it's the only one of our four gospels that's written by a Gentile. And that's going to factor in a lot to what he cares about in his book, what he wants to tell us. Because a lot of Luke's gospel is going to focus on how Jesus came for the Gentiles. So it shouldn't surprise us then that he's concerned about it. He wants us to know that because he himself is a Gentile as well. He's a highly educated physician. In Bible college, if you took Greek, you would read the Gospel of John, because John is the most simple language-wise of the Greek to read. Luke's one of the hardest. He's a highly educated person. Paul will tell us, because Luke travels with Paul later on throughout Paul's missionary journeys off and on. And Paul tells us that Luke is a physician. We actually see that sometimes in the way Luke writes, the way he describes certain illnesses that he encounters or that he is telling us about in Luke and in Acts. He'll use words that are only found in other Greek writings, like by Hippocrates. Hippocrates, you might recognize the word. Think of the Hippocratic Oath that doctors and medical personnel adhere to. The Hippocratic Oath comes from Hippocrates. So some of the words that Luke uses are only found also in Hippocrates, because he's describing very medical specific things. He pulls some punches. Sometimes, if you think of the story, and we'll get to it eventually, but in Mark's gospel, the story of the woman who had the bleeding issue, what Mark says is she went to all these doctors, and they basically drained her wallets, and they still couldn't help her. And when Luke tells us the story, he's like, she saw some people, but nobody could really heal her. So he's like, they kind of say like, oh, okay, Luke, I see you took the insult from the doctors out of that one there. So he's highly educated. He's a physician. He is writing High Greek to, we don't know who this Theophilus is, but he seems to be some person of great importance. It could be a Jewish name, but it's also probably really a Roman citizen, whether it's a Gentile Roman or Jewish Roman, we don't really know. But the person he's writing this gospel on behalf of would understand this High Greek. Yeah, Bo? That Theophilus means what? Oh, God lover. Gotcha. Yeah, that's an interesting one. He's saying, if you didn't hear that, or if you're watching online later, he's saying that Theophilus could just mean God lover or God, friend of God. So it could be a generic term, not a specific person. The reason why we probably don't think that's the case is because somebody funded this. It seems that somebody funded the undertaking for Luke, to write Luke and Acts. And this is more than just like, hey, Theophilus, here's this gospel I wrote and this book of Acts I wrote. Have fun at your book club. That's not the idea behind it. Luke would have understood that Theophilus is going to promote this. He's going to put it out there. He's going to hold a book launch. He's going to, do everything he can to get Luke's writings out there. And he probably funded this. So it's certainly not out of the question that Theophilus is a general term, writing to general people, but we usually understand it to be a real person that he is talking about and addressing both the gospel and the book of Acts too. So Luke's going to have some really unique stories and parables in his gospel. If you think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the parable of the persistent widow, all these are only in Luke. He's the only one that includes those. So he's going to have some really unique stories and parables for us, and those are all going to point to one of Luke's themes or focuses. One of the things he really wants us to know and understand about the life of Jesus is going to come about by those specific stories and parables that he tells us about that the other three gospel writers don't have. Another thing that is unique to Luke is his celebration of women's stories, that he is going to include women's stories. We're going to see this throughout his gospel, of many different women's stories that we don't have in the other Gospels. And one in particular, he's going to really celebrate Mary, the mother of Jesus, and going to focus on her. And that's where we're going to start tonight, is with the birth narratives, the story of the birth of Jesus. And, of course, that's going to involve not just Elizabeth and Anna, but also really focus a lot on Mary, the mother of Jesus. it's from Luke that we get the angel saying, "Hail Mary, full of grace." So if you grew up with a Catholic background, have you ever heard somebody? I was watching a show the other day that was called "In the Eye of the Storm," and it's basically like real life footage of people that get caught in hurricanes, tornadoes. One was on like the Lahaina fires from Hawaii last year, and of course, one of the women who's trying to drive away from being burned up in this fire is saying the Hail Mary, and stuff. And so that comes from Luke's gospel here. So you're not going to be able to see this, but this is just an outline of Luke's gospel. And now that I say it, I just realized I didn't put in the slide that is my outline for our next 5 weeks, but I'll just have to tell you that. But this is kind of just an outline. You can see it later when you get the slides if you do. Because this person tried to lay it out according to some of the seasons, how the seasons change and where Jesus was at certain times of the year throughout his ministry. For us, these next 5 weeks are going to be divided up roughly this way. Tonight will just be the birth of Jesus, chapters 1 and 2. That's what we're going to focus on, the birth of Jesus. Next week will be chapters 3 through 7, which is the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. And then right in the middle there, we'll have chapters 8 through 11, which is the life of a disciple of Jesus. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? And then we'll do chapters 12 through 15, which is the final teachings of Jesus. And then oddly enough, our last week will be chapters 16 through 24, like a big chunk all on the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's mainly because we're going to focus only on what makes Luke unique. We're not going to delve into all the birth or all the death and resurrection parts of the story. We're really just going to focus on where Luke is different and why he tells us something different that the other gospel writers don't tell us. So again, we're going to do the birth of Jesus, the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, the life of the disciple of Jesus, the final teachings of Jesus, and then the death and resurrection of Jesus. So those will be our 5 weeks over these 5 Thursdays. Any questions or comments on that before we look at Luke's introduction? I probably made that writing too small, huh? I think the font in the other ones are a little bigger. Any questions or comments just on any of the introductory stuff before we actually get to his introduction? Yes, Seth? We don't think so. He certainly didn't travel with him as a disciple. He seems to, since he was a Gentile too, he probably really only came to the faith later on, probably sometime during the ministry of Paul. Whether it's Paul who led him to faith or not, we don't really know for sure. But he certainly traveled with Paul, and Paul's the one that tells us he was a physician. And there's parts, if you remember from our service here in Acts, some of the stories are kind of in the first person. Luke kind of, says, I traveled or we went here or something like that throughout some of the stories that we had in the book of Acts. But he doesn't seem to have had any personal knowledge of Jesus or relationship with Jesus of Nazareth. He's going to tell us here in the introduction how he put together his gospel. So that's a good lead-in for this. And Luke starts his gospel this way. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So Theophilus seems to be somebody who either he is a believer or he's kind of on the verge of being a believer. It's kind of hard to know, but he certainly has been taught things about Jesus and the life of a believer. And so Luke is telling him, you've heard these things that have been taught to you. My goal here is to provide you with some certainty, to let you know why these things are trustworthy that you've been hearing taught to you. But look at Luke, how he says, he goes back. He's a reporter. He's going to eyewitnesses. He's talking to people who did know Jesus personally. He's talking to other sources, so he's kind of saying, I'm putting this all together. I went back to the beginning, and I'm putting this all together to make sure that what I'm writing is trustworthy. And again, he's going to write this in this introduction is a very formal style. We don't see it in the other gospel writers, but Luke's introduction here was a very common way to start writings in other Greco-Roman literature. But this little bit just sets forth his purpose. For his purpose for the gospel, not his themes or focuses, which we'll talk about in a minute, but his purpose. His purpose is to let Theophilus, and thereby, because he knows Theophilus is going to promote the gospel, promote the book of Acts, to let Theophilus and all those readers and listeners of his gospel and his book of Acts know why these things are trustworthy that are being told to them about Jesus. These people that are new believers coming to the faith, both Jews and Gentiles, why they can trust what they are being told. So it tells us that Luke's purpose in writing the gospel is both historical and theological. He's meaning for it to be in some sort of way a historical accounting of the life of Jesus. But he's obviously going to pick and choose certain stories. He knows what Mark wrote. He knows what these other sources say. And he's going to choose specific ones because he's got a theological purpose to his gospel as well. He's got points to make, in other words. And each of the gospel writers start their gospels differently from each other. And Luke's certainly is probably the most formal, but he tells us he values these eyewitnesses. He's going to depend on them heavily. So he's not a disciple of Jesus himself, but he's kind of making the point at the beginning, I've got good sources. I've got good eyewitnesses. I've talked to the right people, which is good and interesting. One thing that tells us that Luke really did do some sort of in-depth investigation is Luke's got more characters in his gospel than in the other three writers. He's got over 100 characters in his, and I'm not talking about when it says the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin. I'm talking about people, individuals, or whether they're named or they're just an individual person. Luke's got far more characters than the other gospel writers have in their gospels. I don't know if you've ever seen the show Game of Thrones or read those books, but there's probably other books like them. But there's just everybody joked at the beginning of that show and those books about just the enormous number of characters there were in those and how you could barely keep track of them. So Luke certainly seems to talk to so many people that he has all these different stories, and possibly he talked to the people that he then names or includes in his gospel, because again, he's got quite a cast of characters in his gospel. None of the other gospel writers have as many as he does. And he's going to focus. We'll go to our themes in Luke slide here. Now, if you went and looked at a dictionary of the New Testament or an introduction to the New Testament, or you looked at a commentary on the Gospel of Luke, you would see a number of other different themes that commentator or editor or writer point out about Luke. And we'll talk about a few of those, like how Luke is probably the most joyous of the four Gospels. His book is often called the Gospel of Joy. So there's other themes you could pick out from Luke. But I'm naming these ones because these are the ones that we're going to keep coming back to over and over again throughout Luke's Gospel over these next 5 weeks, is these four. Luke is going to have a particular focus on the poor, the lowly, the marginalized. The middle of his gospel, from about chapter 9 to 19, is often called the gospel of the outcasts. And so Luke's going to have a particular focus on the poor, the lonely, the marginalized, the outcasts of society. And we're going to see that from the very beginning of his gospel tonight with the birth narratives. I mentioned this already a little bit, but he's going to have a unique focus on the stories of women. What Luke's going to often do throughout his gospel is we call it a parallel. I don't know if you were here with Carl or Kelly the last 5 weeks. You know that they in the Psalms talked about parallels. You know, there's like a parallelism, whether it's one verse in the Psalms, like verse A is the same as verse B. It's just a kind of a restating of it. Or sometimes they're opposites. You know, verse A is the opposite of verse B. Or sometimes it's an expansion upon, like verse B is an expansion upon verse A, that there's a parallelism. Luke's going to do that in his gospel with stories of men and women. He's going to tell us a story about a man, then he's going to tell us a story about a woman. Sometimes it's reversed. Sometimes he'll tell the story about the woman first and then tell the story about a man. But he is often throughout his gospel going to have these parallel stories of men and women, which would have been a very unique thing for Luke to do, certainly at that time. And then number 3, Luke's gospel is going to move constantly toward Jerusalem. Especially when we get to chapter 9, verse 51. It's going to tell us Jesus resolutely set his face towards Jerusalem. And everything in Luke's gospel is going to move toward Jerusalem at that point. What takes Mark 1/2 of a chapter to do to get Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, Luke's going to take 10 or 11 chapters. So he's going to have a focus on moving towards Jerusalem. Now, what he's going to do in the book of Acts, if you remember from our sermon series, is in the book of Acts, the very beginning of it tells us that things are going to start in Jerusalem and move out towards Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So that's what Luke is doing in his 2 books here. Really one book, Luke Acts, but the gospel and the book of Acts. The gospel is going to move toward Jerusalem, and the Acts is going to move from Jerusalem towards the ends of the earth. And then finally, another theme we're going to see and talk about throughout the Gospel of Luke is discipleship. What does it mean to follow Jesus? What is required of us? How should we live until Christ returns? So Luke assures his readers of the inclusion of Gentiles in God's plan through the life of Jesus, which we'll see in the gospel, and the life of the church, which we saw in the book of Acts. So he is going to, again, have a focus on Gentiles being included in God's plan. And the way he is going to tell that to us over and over again is by the inclusion of Gentiles in the life of Jesus, and then Gentiles being included in the life of the church body in the book of Acts. So we're gonna focus on the birth narratives. Sometimes these are called the infancy passages, the infancy narratives, the birth narratives, the Christmas stories, however you want to think of them. We only have the birth of Jesus being told to us by Matthew and Luke. They're the only ones that tell us anything about Jesus' birth. How we understand these 2 different versions, one in Matthew and one in Luke, matters. What we think about them, how we hear them, how we understand them. The Christmas story itself, the birth of Jesus stories, are often, if you think about Christmas time, they're often sentimentalized, which is understandable, which is fine, because there's an emotional power to the birth narratives in both Matthew and Luke. But they're very distinct. So I kind of put this up on either side here. If you look at Matthew, he's going to have a genealogy of Jesus. Luke is also going to have a genealogy. Matthew is going to lead off his gospel with that, which is an odd thing to do. Like, if you think about, where you're trying to draw people in, even to this day, Matthew's the first book in the New Testament. So if it's somebody's a new believer or somebody's interested in Christianity, and interested in learning more about the life of Jesus, and they just open the New Testament, and they start with this list of names over and over again. So-and-so was the father of so-and-so, so-and-so was the father of so-and-so. It's like, oh man, what a downer to start your gospel with. But Matthew does that for a very specific purpose that we'll talk about briefly, because we're focusing on Luke's gospel, but to help us understand why Luke tells us the birth stories the way he does. We're also going to talk about the way Matthew does. Luke is going to also have a genealogy, but his is going to be pretty different than Matthew's. Not just because he kind of reverses the order, but because of the names he gives us. But we'll get to that next week. In Matthew's gospel, in the birth narrative, Joseph and Mary are engaged. There's a virgin conception. Sometimes we call that the virgin birth. Sometimes in Catholic circles, there's a distinction between virgin conception and virgin birth. Virgin conception is normally what we mean when we say virgin birth. But there is a belief that Mary remained a virgin even after giving birth. So sometimes they distinguish between virgin conception and virgin birth. We're just going to say virgin birth. We're used to that. But Matthew is the only one that really explicitly tells us that. Luke, it's very heavily implied that Mary is a virgin, but we'll get to that. In Matthew's birth narratives, the angel appears to Joseph. In Luke's birth story, the angel appears to Mary. Then we have the story of Mary going to Elizabeth. In Matthew's gospel, Mary and Joseph seem to live in Bethlehem, and they later moved to Nazareth. In Luke's gospel is probably what the version we're more familiar with, where they live in Nazareth and they travel to Bethlehem, where Jesus is born. Both of them agree that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but they seem to kind of not agree on where they were living at the time. And there's some reasons maybe for that. Matthew's the only one that tells us about wise men or magi, and Luke's the only one that tells us about shepherds coming. So again, those are things that we normally combine in our mind. If you see a Christmas pageant or play or whatever, or you're just thinking of the Christmas story, you see the movie, we normally combine all these components into one, which is fine. I don't have any problem with that. I like those things. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But there is a value to understanding why Matthew tells it one way and Luke tells it the other. Matthew's also going to have this escape to Egypt under the threat of Herod trying to kill newborn boys or boys up to 2 years old. Matthew's the one that tells us that the first family, the Holy Family, escaped to Egypt. Luke is the one that says there's no room in the house. Normally, we'll get to this in a minute, but normally we think of that as no room in the inn. In the middle there, you can see the ones that there's none or outside the Bible is an inn or an innkeeper and a donkey. Neither of them say that Mary rode to Bethlehem or whatever on a donkey. So that's something else we seem to have added. And that actually comes from one of those other goofy gospels that are outside of our Bible, the idea of Mary riding on a donkey. In Luke's gospel, we have the angel's announcement to the shepherds. We have Jesus' presentation in the temple. We have the stories of Anna and Simeon. And then we have the story of 12-year-old Jesus in the temple. And that's the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple story is where we're going to start next week. So hopefully we'll get to this other stuff tonight. But like I said, we'll start with the story of the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple, which is the only story we have in any of the Gospels of Jesus as a boy. And so like I said, we'll start next week with that, and I'll tell you some of the other goofy Gospel stories of Jesus as a boy. Any questions or comments on that before we actually look at the birth narratives in Matthew and in Luke? Yeah, the question is, if Luke was doing all this research, why didn't he include more childhood stories? He includes one that the other gospel writers did not include, but Why didn't Luke give us more? That's a good question. We don't really know. It's possible that people didn't know a whole lot of stories of Jesus as a boy. He probably led a very typical Jewish boy life up until he began his ministry. Working with his father, learning the trade that his father had, living in a very small town in Nazareth. Because both Matthew and Luke tell us that Jesus grows up in Nazareth. Whether they move there like Matthew says, or they're there and they go back home to Nazareth, they seem to agree that he grows up in Nazareth. So we don't know if just either there weren't a whole lot of stories about him out there as a boy, or the ones he heard he didn't think weren't going to contribute to his gospel, like the purposes he had for his gospel, and so he just left them out. I mean, certainly, I know to us it's like we wish we had more stories, and that's kind of why we'll start next week with I'll just tell you some of the stories we do have from other gospels, because people are naturally curious about that. What was Jesus like as a boy? What did he know, and when did he know it? So we have stories of him doing weird miracles, of striking a boy that he had a fight with dead, because people are thinking, what would he have been like as a boy? If he was God and had the power of God, would he been a bratty boy with the power to strike another boy dead? So it's a natural thing to wonder, and so that's why we get all these other gospel writers telling us these stories about Jesus as a boy. But so yeah, we'd like to know more, but I think for Luke and probably the other gospel writers, they just didn't think it was something that added value to their gospel. The question is there a story about how Luke came to faith? Not that we know of, not anything specific. He doesn't give us a conversion story like Paul does, or the one he tells about Paul, and then Paul gives himself later in one of his letters as well. We don't get that from something like that from Luke. It's another good question, because another thing I think we'd like to know about him. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, Matthew, like I said, his gospel, Matthew's gospel, is going to start off with this genealogy of Jesus. It goes 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. So that's why it's divided up in 3 there. And he starts with Abraham. Abraham is the start of the genealogy, leading all the way down to, on the far bottom right there, you see Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So Matthew traces Abraham to Jesus. Luke's going to go all the way back to Adam. But the reason Matthew goes Abraham to Jesus is one of Matthew's themes throughout his gospel, one of his main purposes in writing his gospel is, for Matthew, Jesus is the new Moses. So it's important to trace this history back to Abraham and the beginning of the story of the people of God, of the Jewish people, of the Israelite people. So again, for Matthew, Jesus is the new Moses. And that's going to factor into a lot of the things that he includes in his story. So I don't have this up on the screen, but if you want to look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 18, it says, Matthew says, this is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law, yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son. You are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, notice there, the birth of Jesus isn't even mentioned until this kind of final just in passing at the end here. Like all this lead up, you can see the pictures up on the screen of Joseph having this encounter with the angel coming to him in his dreams. And then he wakes up, he decides to stick with Mary, and then it just says, she gave birth to a son, and they gave him the name Jesus. The birth of Jesus in Matthew is kind of just thrown in there almost. It's a little anticlimactic. Because in Matthew's gospel, Joseph's the main character of the birth narrative, the story of Jesus' birth. Joseph's the main character. He is the one acting. Mary is acted upon. She's kind of just a subject in the background with Joseph. We're going to see the opposite in Luke's gospel. But for Matthew's gospel, Joseph is the main character here. There's no story of the birth itself like we're going to get in Luke. There's no journey to Nazareth. Like I said, there's no innkeeper or stable or manger or swaddling clothes, no angels singing, no shepherds, and there's no wise men even at the birth. Normally we have the manger scene, that our nativity sets at Christmas time, and they always have the shepherds and the wise men. But the wise men came much later. They weren't there the night of Jesus' birth. It's certainly not according to Matthew. So then Joseph has another dream. This is after the wise men had gone. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in another dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So again, Matthew was showing us Jesus is the new Moses. So whereas Moses escapes from Egypt, Jesus escapes to Egypt. But they're both called out of Egypt to save their people, to save the people of God. So this is Matthew. Matthew's the only one that tells us about this escape to Egypt and this coming back out of Egypt. And he tells us that's to fulfill this prophecy that out of Egypt I called my son. So again, even in this, Joseph's the main character here. And Mary, but even especially Jesus, is kind of just an offstage character in Matthew's story here. The focus is really on Joseph's dilemma. Do I stay married? Do I stay true to Mary or not? His attempt to save his family, to get him out of Bethlehem, when we have this incident called the slaughter of the innocents, where Herod has now commanded all boys up to 2 years old to be killed. And Matthew's going to continue this. So if you think about in our the beginning of our Bible in the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those 5 books we call the 5 books of Moses. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is going to make 5 big speeches, but 5 sermons, 5 speeches, whatever you want to call them. In Matthew's gospel, this is going to be a difference we're going to see between Luke and Matthew. Matthew tells us about the Sermon on the Mount. When Luke tells us that story, he is going to tell us when Jesus gives that sermon on a low place, on a plain or in a valley. But Matthew has it on a mountainside. Why? Because Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the law, with the tablets, the 10 Commandments, with the law. And Jesus, up on a mountainside, gives the new law. So Matthew's going to have 5 fulfillments of prophecy. He mentions Jesus as the Messiah 5 times. Even in Matthew's genealogy, he mentions 5 women. And so for Matthew, Jesus is the new Moses, the new lawgiver, the new deliverer, the new Savior, not just for God's chosen people, but for all people. That's going to be one of Matthew's things he focuses on, is being Jesus coming as a Messiah for all the world. Because he's going to start his gospel by telling us about the next people, the Magi, the wise men, who are Gentiles. How does Matthew end his gospel? The Great Commission. Go into all the world, making disciples of all nations. And so that's going to be important again for Matthew. Here's a little picture of wise men following the star to Bethlehem. This is, let's see, Matthew. You know what? We're going to skip that because we're going to run out of time. But what's the next slide? Oh, you know what? Stay there for a second. I'm not going to read through the stories of the wise men and the magi, but it's important to think about them following this star in the sky. For Matthew, he tells us that story because it's similar to Jesus' people, the Israelites, wandering in the desert, following the sun by day and the light by night. So there's this aspect to this cloud and this theme of light up in the sky, just like the wise men follow this light in the sky as well. Probably a lot of you know this, but we don't. Matthew doesn't ever tell us there's 3 wise men. We just are told of 3 gifts. So often the tradition became there were three dudes because there are 3 gifts. Here's some artwork of the slaughter of the innocents, and again, Matthew tells us this story when Luke doesn't. Because, again, think about Pharaoh when Moses was born. What was Pharaoh trying to do? Kill all the baby boys. So what does Matthew tell us about? A similar story about Jesus, of Herod hunting the baby boys throughout his empire or throughout his command region. So, again, Matthew is concerned with showing us throughout his gospel, in particular his birth story, that Jesus is the new Moses. Another thing that it's interesting about our nativity scenes or sets, our artwork that depicts this, if you look at nativity scenes, they almost always include an ox and a donkey. I don't know how well you can see that up on the screen. This is from the 4th century, so the 300s. So already very early on in the tradition of depicting the birth of Jesus, we have an ox and a donkey in the scene. But Luke and Matthew never tell us about an ox and a donkey. Neither of them tell us anything about an ox and a donkey being there. But throughout history, that's from the 300s. This one's much harder to make out. This is at the top of you can see the ox and the donkey there at the top, just above where it says 6th century Palestine. This one's more clear. Ox and a donkey hanging out there just above the baby Jesus. Here's one of baby Jesus. He looks like he's chillaxing. That's why I put that. Jesus looks very hip and with it, like laid back there, like baby Jesus. But just above him, you see an ox and a donkey. This is the Jones family nativity set, where we actually had an ox and a donkey as well in our nativity set. Probably if you look at yours, you have one too. We also had a headless wise man. He lost his head somewhere over the years. We don't know what happened to him. We don't know which one he is either, but the poor guy. But the reason that became a thing, like very early on, to depict the birth of Jesus with an ox and a donkey, is because in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "An ox knows its owner, and a donkey knows its master's crib." And so the tradition became this idea of putting an ox and a donkey in there, because even they recognize right away who this child who was born into the world is. What's interesting about an ox and a donkey, too, is an ox is a clean animal and a donkey is an unclean animal. This would have fit right in with both Matthew and Luke's Gospels, because for both of them, they're going to show us how Jesus came to the Gentiles, to all the nations of the world, both ox and donkey, both clean and unclean, both Jew and Gentile. Any questions just about Matthew's gospel before we look at how Luke is different? All right. Well, here this is Luke. Luke chapter 1, verse 5, right after his introduction. This is the section in your Bible. It probably says the birth of John the Baptist foretold. It says, in the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they are both very old. Once when Zechariah's division was on duty, he was serving as priest before God. He was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of the incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He has never detected... let's skip that. The angel said to him, verse 19, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, until the day John the Baptist, his son, is born. Because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time. When Zechariah came out, he could not speak to the people. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. The Lord has done this for me, she said. In these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people. So that's the start. So the picture you're seeing up there is the angel appearing to Zechariah. And just as we're going to see over and over again throughout Luke's gospel, there is a parallel story of an angel appearing to a woman, this time to Mary. So verse 26 begins with in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you. Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive in the womb and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. I put that in those brackets there because we're on the next slide. Sorry, whoops. Oh, never mind. We'll go better. Oh, I think I put these slides first because this is sorry. Do go to the next slide. This is a picture of inside a church in Nazareth today called the Basilica of the Annunciation. In other words, the church where the announcing of the angel to Mary about the birth of Jesus happened. This is a closer look. What you're seeing there is a grotto or a cave. Throughout the land of Israel, Bethlehem, Nazareth, all around, people lived inside caves. So what they often did was they built kind of a home on top of a cave and used the cave as it's almost like not having to build a whole first story of your house because it's already built into the land and you just kind of build the second story on top. So this was a common thing to do. This cave that's there is the traditional site of where the angel announced to Mary about the birth of Jesus. We don't have any real solid evidence that it is. But this is the traditional spot that the church goes. Here's a closer look. You can kind of see in the background on the right there a staircase that goes up. So that kind of gives you an idea of they would use this bottom level of the cave, but there was a upper part to the house that the stairs led to. Okay, now I'll go to that next slide. I put in brackets in the womb because that's in the original language, in the original Greek it says that. Which is kind of a funny thing to say because it's kind of like, well, where else would she conceive? You will conceive in the womb. I don't know if that's Luke's physician talk coming out. He's a doctor, but he's not an OBGYN. So we're going to see. He doesn't tell us exactly how this is going to happen, and Mary is going to wonder. But he does tell us she'll conceive in the womb and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. How will this be? Mary asked the angel, since I am a virgin. The angel answered, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called Son of God. So again, he says the Most High will overshadow you. We don't really know what that means. Again, Luke might be a doctor, but he's not an OBGYN. He's not going to try and explain to us how this is going to happen, how exactly Mary is going to become pregnant if she is indeed a virgin. In Luke's gospel, the word he uses there probably just means something like a young woman, but since it's usually a young woman under 14 or about that age, we usually understand it to mean that she would be a virgin. Certainly the rest of the story implies that that's the case. Otherwise, why would this be a miraculous thing to happen to her? So that's why I said Matthew's explicit about Mary being a virgin, heavily implied in Luke's gospel. But this question that Mary asks, how will this be, or how can this be? What's funny is people tried to answer this question throughout church history. We'll get to that in a minute. But the angel says, the Most High will overshadow you. Then goes on, even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who is said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month. For no word from God will ever fail. I am the Lord's servant, Mary answered. May your word to me be fulfilled. And then the angel left her. Go to this next slide. And throughout kind of art history of this portrayal of the angel announcing to Mary about the birth of Jesus, look at the picture on the left. If you look on the far left of that, you can sort of make out that Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, which is kind of an odd thing to include. But throughout history, a lot of artwork about the annunciation of the birth of Jesus from the angel to Mary includes in the background Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Because the idea is that what Mary is bringing about is a reversal of that. That people are going to be welcomed back into God's presence because of this event. The picture on the right is much harder to make out there. This is what I mean. When Mary said, how can this be? How can it be that I'm going to give birth if I'm a virgin? People in church history tried to figure it out. How exactly could Mary become pregnant? One of the ideas that of how this actually happened is she became pregnant through her ear. So if you look at that picture on the right, the angel Gabriel almost has these like chopsticks or something looking things, and he's got it in her ear, and you can't make it out in there, but there's like a miniature baby Jesus going over through her ear. That tradition started because this is from a church in, I think, Germany today. So, but that started out because what the idea was that the Word, like John's gospel, the Word was made flesh. The Word came to be dwelling inside of Mary. So how do you hear a word? Through your ear. So there's a bunch of artwork throughout history of the annunciation of the baby Jesus to the birth of Jesus to Mary, where it includes something like this, where she is becoming pregnant with Jesus through her ear. So when she said, how can this be? A bunch of people in church history said, yeah, how can that be? Let's come up with some really weird reasons how that could be. What I love is Mary's response, too, in verse 38. I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. In Greek, it's more literally, I am God's slave woman. But so why Luke would include that kind of harshness to it? I am God's slave woman, not just like I am the servant of God. I am God's slave woman. It's important for Luke that we understand that even though he uses this term God's slave woman, that it is Mary's free choice, that she is choosing this. She is choosing to be to go along with God's plans. Because for Luke, again, he wants us to know that everyone, men and women, are invited to discipleship with Jesus, are invited to lives of discipleship following God. That for Luke, there's a holiness in being able to say whatever God wants. Whatever God wants. Not because he told us so, but because God is trustworthy. That we can trust the things that God is asking us to do in living our lives as disciples following him. And that we get that here with Mary. I am God's slave woman. Whatever you want, God, whatever you want, let it happen to me according to the way that you said. Verse 39, at that time Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea, where she entered Zechariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her." So you can see some depictions there of Mary encountering Elizabeth. We don't know how far she... If Mary is indeed living in Nazareth at this time, she traveled quite a ways to come visit with Elizabeth, which would have shown her dedication. If, like in Matthew's gospel, she lives nearby, it's still a nice thing. Go visit her, but not quite the journey. So Elizabeth proclaims, "Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her." And then we have this, in the Catholic Church and in like some mainline Protestant churches, they call this the Magnificat, because it starts with that word in Latin, Magnificat. My soul magnifies, my soul glorifies, my soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies and glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors." Oops, I forgot to go to the next slide. Oh, Jared's on it, though. Thanks. I love, the story you hear often, because Mary, did you know that your baby boy, that song, and it goes through all the different things. Like, I love that. I heard somebody say one time that this, in response to Mary, did you know, is the Magnificat. In other words, it's kind of like Mary's like, yeah, I knew. I was aware. I still, if you love that song, I don't want to take anything away from it, because it's still a great song to make you wonder about Mary herself. To think of Mary as a person, as a woman, what did she think about this son that she had? And what did she think as she tried to raise him? So there's still value to the song, but I do agree with the idea that Mary, in response to Mary, did you know, we have the Magnificat. I've said this before. One of my favorite sermons that Guy ever preached was a few years ago during Christmas time, when he preached through the Magnificat, which I don't know if you know how lucky you are that he did that. That is not a common thing for a Protestant evangelical church to do. A Catholic priest will preach a homily on the Magnificat. Mainline Protestant churches will sometimes do more. We usually do the first verse or two or something like that, So I just love that sermon. If you want to go, it's on our website. It was from December 5th, 2021. So if you want to go back and listen to that, I'd encourage you to. That's one of my favorite sermons Guy ever preached. And it's about the Magnificat, the Mary's song, as we normally see it in our English translation. But I just thought Mary said yes. Mary said, "I am God's slave woman. Let it be done unto me." There's a fancy word, Theotokos. If you've been to Israel, a lot of churches, there's a symbol for Theotokos, and it'll be in a lot of different churches all over the world, not just Israel. Theotokos means literally mother of God. And basically, Mary said yes. What Mary was saying in response to God was, I will be your mother. Yes, I will be your mother. Mary had faith and hope God would fulfill his promises to her, and then she birthed hope into our world. And then mothered that hope from a boy to the man sent to die for our sins and to be the final hope for all the world. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, this is verse 57, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. Remember that Zechariah, the one who the angel appeared to, then he was made silent. He can't speak right now. He's married to Elizabeth. They were going to name him after his father, Zechariah, but his mother spoke up and said, no, he is to be called John. They said to her, there's no one among your relatives who has that name. When they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child, then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet. You can kind of see that on the left-hand side there. He wrote, his name is John. Here's another version of that. You can kind of see him over on the far left there. John the Baptist has been born there. Over on the far left is Zechariah writing. So he asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, his name is John. Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbors were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about, asking, what then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hand was with him. We don't have time to read through Zechariah's song, except for the last part, verse 79, that God, to shine on those living in darkness and the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. And then the child, John the Baptist, grew and became strong in spirit, and he lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel. So notice so far what Luke has done here. Angel appears to Zechariah. Angel appears to Mary. Mary gives a song. Zechariah gives a song. So that's what I'm talking about when throughout Luke's gospel, we're going to see this parallel between a story about a man and a story about a woman. Luke's going to tell us and include and celebrate a lot of these stories about women. And so we have angel to Zechariah, angel to Mary. Mary gives her song. Zechariah gives his song. And now the main event. Luke chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room at the inn or guest room available for them. Very different than Matthew's version, where he's just like, oh, okay, Mary had a son, they named him Jesus. It's like very quick story, nothing about the birth. Luke tells us a little more detail here about how it came about, the birth of Jesus himself. Normally we picture this journey. Again, neither of them mention a donkey, but this is normally how we picture it. Joseph and Mary traveling to Bethlehem on a donkey. We don't know which way they would have taken from Nazareth, if that's the way they went. There was kind of two ways to go. You could either go down to the Jordan River Valley, which is on the right-hand side there. Leads from basically the Sea of Galilee. The Jordan River runs from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea. You can kind of see the Dead Sea there kind of at the bottom, that blue shaded area. So that yellow path, you go down the Jordan River Valley to Jericho, then up the hills to Jerusalem. we're actually going to see Jesus travel this path when he finally comes to Jerusalem to be crucified. This is the way he's going to take, which is why he encounters like Zacchaeus in Jericho on his way there. If you've been to Israel, especially if you've been to Israel with me, you know this route. We go up and down the ascent of Adumim, it's called, between Jerusalem and Jericho. So that would have been one way to travel. We also travel the other way, right up the middle of the country. They could have come from Nazareth straight down the middle of the country. You followed like a ridge, basically, that goes the whole way. The only problem with that route is it goes through the area of the Samaritans, and as we'll see and talk about more when we get to the parable of the Good Samaritan and some other stories that Luke tells us, Jews and Samaritans do not get along. So we don't know which way they would have traveled, but we do always have this idea that they get to what we normally have translated in English as there's no room for them at the inn. The problem with that is that's not what that word means. The word for inn, Luke actually gives us in a different place, in the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you're familiar with that, we're going to get to that in a couple of weeks, but if you're familiar with it, you know that the Samaritan man takes care of the Jewish man and checks him into an inn and even pays the innkeeper. So we have the words for both inn and innkeeper in Luke's gospel, but they're not in the birth narratives. There's no innkeeper, and there's not even an inn. It's better translated, I think, the way the NIV did it in this instance, which is guest room. Here's another version. We kind of, this is normally what we picture. Notice the ox and donkey, of course, in this nativity setting. You have the shepherds on the right. You have the wise men on the left, which there doesn't seem to be any supporting evidence that they were there on either the Magi were there, the wise men were there on the night of Jesus' birth. We also, for both Matthew and Luke's Gospels, Jesus doesn't even seem to be born the night they arrive. Normally, that's what we picture. They're weary and tired. They're on the donkey. They get into town. There's no room at the inn, and they have to make do with what they got. If you look at both Matthew's version and Luke's version, they're there in Bethlehem for a while, at least, before the baby Jesus is born. So what would this actually mean to say that there's no room for them in the inn? What is this word actually here? It's not, normally we think of a stable, that's what we normally picture here. But the word there is kataluma. Again, just traditionally translated as inn. But the word for inn is in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where he also has a word for the innkeeper. But this word here is the same word that's used for the upper room, for the Last Supper in the gospel. When Jesus tells his disciples to go find a man who will show you an upper room, and that's where they go to have the Last Supper, it's the same word that Luke uses there that he uses in the birth narrative. So it's not an inn. Like Bethlehem would have been small at that time. There wouldn't have been any like Three Amigos. There's no hotel in this town. They wouldn't have had something like that. Inns and hotels and stuff were something that you'd only have in a place that could warrant it. Like the inn. Now the parable of the Good Samaritan is a parable. It's meaning it's not a historical event. It's a story. But this inn that Jesus talks about in that parable probably was a real place, and it would have been on that ascent of Adumim that we, to this, in our day and age, would take the bus up and down it. Back then they had to walk or travel on a donkey, but so there wouldn't have been something like that in this town. Some better understandings of that word is guest room, upper room, lodging, maybe even dining room. Here's some. Try to show you some ideas on what a first century house would have looked like at that time. What they often did was, this is not a house that's built over a cave. What Jesus seems to be born inside of a cave with the house over it. But even in this version of a house at that time, you can see like there's a bottom level that's kind of a courtyard, and then there's the upper room. There's the upper part of the house there. that often had like, the kitchen area, the family room, like sleeping areas, but there was also a kataluma. There was a guest room. There was a place for guests to stay that, if they were there. Here's another version. You can see animals in that one too, in the courtyard of that house. Here's another version. You can kind of see the different levels of a house, and there's an upper part and a lower part. Here's kind of from a museum. I don't know how well you can make that out, but here's another version. Like they recreated this where there's this bottom level courtyard where they often kept their animals because for a number of reasons. Number one, if it's wintertime, during the wintertime, the animals' body heat helped heat the house. You also kept your animals inside there for protection, both from theft, other animals killing them. So it was a way to protect them. They used manure for fuel, so it was an easy fuel source to just keep your animals in the house, like in this lower courtyard with you. Here's kind of an artist's rendition, kind of like a CGI version or something, again, of this lower area, this lower kind of courtyard. Here's actually a picture from Nazareth village where we visit when we go to Israel. So another version you can kind of see here that there's this lower part of a house with, you can see kind of that, it's labeled storage room, and it says in parentheses, with manger, there in that kind of lower entryway. And then there's the upper room. There's the part of the house that's upstairs. Even today, there's a dude in Israel that he didn't have a lot of money, so he found a cave and he built a home over the cave in Israel. This is his house. There's also a fancy Airbnb version of this. You can Airbnb a cave house in Israel and stay inside of it, but that just shows you what that they would use this natural part of the landscape to live in, to build their houses over. So in Israel, actually a lot of nativity scenes depict the birth of Jesus inside of a cave. Churches, people in their personal homes, like they have nativity sets that look much more like this than usually the ones we have. This idea of Jesus being born inside of a cave there. And then, of course, it says that the inside of that cave, or where they were, because there's no room in the guest room, there's no room in the upper room. We don't really know why there's no room for them. Again, they've been there around for a while. So why would there be no room in the guest room? Well, if there's a whole bunch of people from Joseph's family that have now traveled to Bethlehem and there's a whole bunch of people in the house, maybe there's no room for them in that guest room anymore. Or it could just be there's a lot of people up there, and would she want to give birth in the middle of the living room with the whole family around? Nope. So there's not any room. It's almost like Luke saying there's no room for that. There's no room for what Mary needs to do to give birth to Jesus. Some have suggested that there's no room for Mary because the people there would have rejected her. Like she would have been seen as illegitimately pregnant. And so there's no room for her, like she's being rejected. But either way, we don't know why there's no room in the guest room, in the upper room. But it's not an inn. So they go down to this lower level where the animals are, where the manger is. The manger is just a trough. On the left there is an actual stone manger. On the right is a stone manger built in. I'm trying to reenact the baby Jesus there for you. But the stone manger, that's what it looked like. Normally we kind of picture this wooden structure trough or something, but a manger at the time usually would have been made of something like carved into the stone wall or carved freestanding like the one on the left there. You probably can't make out. The one on the right that I'm sitting in actually has a hole like that they carved through that you would tie the rope through to keep the animal in place next to the manger there. And so there's no room in the guest room, so they go down to the lower level where the animals would be or would normally be, and that's where Mary gives birth and takes the baby Jesus and places them in the manger. We're out of time, so we're going to have to pick up there next week. We'll start with what that looks like today, what the cave that Jesus said to have been born in, what it looks like today inside the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. But we got 2 minutes, so are there any just questions, comments, anything jumping out at you? Yeah, Baxter? Yeah, the question is, why did it come to be that this idea of them checking into a Hilton or trying to find a hotel? There's probably a couple reasons. Number one is probably just a misunderstanding of the word itself. Again, Luke is writing in fancy Greek, so it could be that it just was not understood what he was talking about. So it's just a mistranslation or misunderstanding of what that is. But it probably also has to do with just tradition and what that would look like. Like, it's almost like for some people thought it was a better story if the way that we often think of it, like Mary and Joseph, weary from the travels, like getting into Bethlehem that night, and she's in labor pains, and they go to an inn, and the guy points at the no vacancy sign and says, no, like you can't stay here. And then they have to go to this lowly place, which it is a lowly place. Again, Luke's going to focus on the poor, the lowly, the outcast, the marginalized, and that's going to contribute to how he's telling this birth narrative. So it is that place, but this idea of them coming in and being rejected, I think some people thought that was a better story, or just a different way to tell it. But again, both Matthew and Luke seem to have, whether in Matthew's gospel they're already living there, or Luke's gospel where they travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, both of them have them there pretty much already. Because even in Luke's gospel, you kind of said after they get to Bethlehem, he's like, oh, and sometime later, is when this happens. And so, yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yep.
As I think about it, I think that the moment of conception takes place in the fallopian tube.
Mm-hmm.
But to conceive in the womb, that's a miracle.
Okay, you're getting more scientific than I can be. His point is that the conception happens in the fallopian tube, so to conceive in the womb is what the miracle is. I understand that. I'm just not sure what Luke's Greek would have meant at that point. For him to include the phrase in the womb versus just to say you'll conceive. Interesting point, though. Any other questions or comments, observations? Well, if you do, I'll be around. And like I said, we'll pick up next week with looking at more of the birth of Jesus and get into those stories of Jesus as a boy before we see the beginning of his ministry. So I hope to see you next week.